Okay, so now I will introduce our speaker. This is Milledge Murray. He was born in Augusta, Georgia. He moved to North Augusta, and he is named for Milledge Galphin Murray after his fifth generation great grandfather, Dr. John Milledge Galphin, who was the grandson of Indian trader George Galphin. Milledge grew up in North Augusta, graduated from North Augusta High School in '65, and from Clemson University in 1969 with a BS degree. After a tour of basic training in the U.S. Army Reserves, he joined the Trust Company Bank, which later became the Sun Trust Bank, and for 39 years he worked in banking. 32 of those years were in Augusta. Since retirement, he has volunteered at the Arts and Heritage Center of North Augusta, worked with many historical projects in North Augusta, and you previously served as the president of the North Augusta Heritage Council. And as I understand it, today is your father's birthday. Very good. So welcome, Milledge Murray.
I am so honored that you are here in this room on Super Bowl Sunday. So I better give you some very good information. And how I want to begin this talk, I want to just go back in history about early settlement in this area. And if we go back to, we'll say 1685, okay? In 1685, at the end of the Sandbar Ferry Road on the South Carolina side, there is a bluff, and you had people who settled that area, primarily from Switzerland. The Carolina colonies were established in 1670, and something that happened back then was that you had the settlers here, and you had a lot of Indian Native Americans that lived here for many, many years. And Native Americans, primarily from Augusta area towards the coast, they were primarily Muskogee Creek Indians. Now, we're going to mention something called Indian trading. Now, there's no trading of Indians. It was trading with the Indians, and that's a very important concept. So if we mention Indian traders, what we're doing is we're talking about merchants that traded with the Indians. And this activity started long before George Galphin came over. But if you think about Native Americans, what did they have is their cash? What did they have to trade with the merchants? They had animal skins. Animal skins were very important to the British, Europeans, and if you think about it, the Indians, over here you had lots of land that was kind of a new frontier. In Europe, it had been inhabited for hundreds and literally thousands of years. You didn't have a frontier with animal skins or wild animals like you had over here. So it became a lucrative business. It's kind of hard to imagine this area being active with Native Americans back then. But we really were. And the reason why there were a lot of Native Americans here before there were European settlers is because the Indians lived along waterways. If you were to look at a map of the English colony of America at that time, the farthest west that could be traveled by water would be the Augusta area, where the fall line begins. The distance between the Augusta area to the coast is 212 miles. Now, it's not that far to get to Savannah. It's less than 212 miles, but the Savannah River, it winds around. And so by water, it is that far. If you also have to think about America having ports, major ports where ships can come in. And so at that time, in the 1700 era, you had St. Augustine, you had Charlestown at that time, you had up in Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, but there were not that many ports. Now, if you were an Indian tribe and you needed to trade with the Indian traders, then for you to get to where the ships came in, it would take you, you say you have a canoe or a flatboat or whatever, it'd probably take you 30 days. And how much stuff could you put in the canoe or the flatboat? And so it just made sense that you had to have Indian trading take place at a place like Augusta. Georgia did not get settled until about 1735. And I learned that people went and met with Oglethorpe to talk with him about establishing the town of Augusta. You had an establishment in the Beach Island area, and in 1714, for several years, you had a fort. The fort was called Fort Moore. It was built to house 100 soldiers. The reason for Fort Moore was that they wanted to make sure that they could protect the Europeans who were living around where the Native Americans were. So you had to have some sort of a presence or a police force or whatever. And what is very unusual about Fort Moore, it was built for 100 soldiers, but the first garrison at Fort Moore were occupied by 30 Ethiopian black soldiers who were Ethiopia was an English colony, and so they were there. George Galphin was born in 1710 in Armagh, Ireland, in the county of Antrim. His parents were linen workers, but in Ireland during that time, there was a bad bad depression. He's a young man. He and his sister decide that they are going to leave Ireland and they want to come to America, the new frontier, to make a living. And so they left. And we're going to learn some things about George Galphin that are not great, but it's history, and we have to be accurate on that. One thing was that when George Galphin was 25 years old, he hops on a boat to come to America. He actually left a wife. Her name was Catherine Saunderson. We don't hear about her again until we have George Galphin's will. So that's the story. George Galphin and his sister arrive in Charleston. What does he see when he gets off the boat? He sees these warehouses packed with animal skins. I mean, in activity, it's just all kind of stuff going on. Also, you've got these ships loaded with goods that are there to be traded with the Native Americans. All kinds of things that I mean, you got clothes, you got dishes, you got kitchenware, you got guns, you've got just all kinds of stuff. Later on, rum is part of the package too. But guns, gunpowder, just all kinds of things. So the Indians want that merchandise, and they have these Indians, these animal skins to trade. And Galphin sees this activity going on, and he decides that this is what he wants to do as this is going to be his occupation in the New World. He learns pretty early on that if you want to gain acceptance in this world, the world of Indian trading, that you need to be in relationship with a Native American wife. That's just something that went on. So he ended up in a relationship with a lady named Nida Chucky. There was actually another relationship that happened before that with a Bridget Shaw pretty quickly. That did not last long. No kids. But Nida Chucky, he did have a relationship, and they had a child named Barbara. But what Nida Chucky did for him was he was able to learn how to communicate with the Native American tribes, which was very important, to learn how to communicate and to have some status with them. So that was an important relationship. So he was an outgoing person. He did very well with relationships. When a company in the Augusta area recruited him to come to the Augusta area, that company was called Brown, Ray and Company. Patrick Brown, John Ray. We know John Ray from Ray's Creek, Augusta National. So George Galphin comes to the Augusta area. His sister goes all the way to Louisville, Georgia, which was called Queensboro at the time. We don't hear much of her anymore, but George Galphin scouted out the area, and he knew that he needed to have his trading post near the waterway. Okay, now, Georgia was established in 1735 by James Oglethorpe, but the trustees of Georgia and Oglethorpe established Georgia as a non-slave colony. And slavery at the time was important to Galphin because he needed workers to help him with his activities. And so he locates a property that's a tributary off of the Savannah River. And if you look at it, we've seen a picture of it. It has these cliffs, and when the sun shines on it, it looks like the silver. And he was able to get a British land grant. There we go. And it looks like that now. I mean, it's beautiful. It's the Audubon Nature Society. And he named it Silver Bluff. So y'all are aware of Silver Bluff. And so that's how Silver Bluff got its name. And that became his main trading post. He later ended up having a trading post in the Louisville area near the Ogeechee River. I wasn't going to bring this up, but I'm going to. I think there's a story, it's kind of a neat story and this is a little later on, with Galphin has developed relationships with an Indian chief. And so this Indian chief goes up to Galphin and says, Mr. Galphin, me had a dream last night, and me dreamed that you gave me that beautiful red coat that you're wearing. And Galphin said, well, if you dreamed it, it is so. And so Galphin gave him the red coat. And then there were several other exchanges like that. And finally, Galphin knew that the old Indian chief was trying to get the best of him. And he said, Galphin said, me also had a dream last night. Me had a dream that you gave me all this land along the Ogeechee River. And so the Indian chief says, if you dream it, it is so. We dream no more. But anyway, Galphin, early on, and I mean, we're talking about in the 1740s and 1750s and 1760s, he is developing his empire. He's trying to acquire land. And I was wondering, how does he get these British land grants? Well, it's because he had a relationship with the crown. I mean, they were who was providing the supplies, and he was providing the skins, and it was doing very well. Brown, Ray and Company became the largest supplier of deer skins in the southern region, maybe America. I mean, they were a huge deer skin provider. And we know that Galphin, in acquiring properties in the Georgia area, as well as in the Carolina area, he acquired property in the Sand Hills area of Augusta, which is Milledge Road, Augusta Country Club. He's even on title for part of the property with Augusta National because his partner is John Ray, Ray's Creek. But this is long before Prosper Berkman's came. And this is back in the 1700s. But he is on title for part of the property. And then he did his primary business in Georgia. In South Carolina, though, he had a wonderful plantation with a lot of structures. And he did have a number of slaves. But I think one thing that helped him was the relationship that he had with the members of his family through where he had children, and also the way he was able to communicate. And we know that William Bartram paid him a visit, and it's in his record where he said that George Galphin had a whole lot of influence, and you could tell. And I know that one thing that happened at the plantation at Silver Bluff was that once a year in May, they had something called the King's Gift. And so the king would provide a lot of stuff that they would give away, and they would have kind of like a Mardi Gras type experience out there. And that was very unusual, but it partying and whatever. Then he had a second plantation in Georgia, and we just know that when his estate was large with lots of land in Georgia and South Carolina. We've had some pictures up here of certainly of Silver Bluff. There's a picture of Spirit Creek, McBean area, South Carolina, many acres there. And during this period, you had, since we were an English colony, this is long before the American Revolution, George Galphin always was there to solve different problems that would come up between the Native Americans. Let's say they had a skirmish somewhere or having problems, George Galphin was the person that they went to solve that problem. And then he also had a relationship, a lady from Cherokee, a Creek lady from Coweta. Her name was Matani. And Matani was a very, very important marital type relationship for George Galphin. They had 3 kids. One was named John, one was named George, and a daughter named Judith. And they were very involved with helping George Galphin run the plantation. And throughout time, they were very key to him. Some things that I learned that are very important to me regarding George Galphin was in 1770, in the 1770s, he allowed traveling pastors to preach to the slaves on the Galphin plantation. And a guy by the name of Matthew Moore would come there, and they would meet as a group in a brush arbor. We had a group that met together and published a book about a slave preacher named George Lyle, who was from Jefferson County. And in our research, we saw exactly how he became an ordained pastor as a slave. He came and preached to the slaves, and in doing so, he became the first black ordained pastor in America at that time. Right after the Revolution, he goes to Savannah and establishes a church there. In fact, if you go to Savannah, you got this old Bryan church down there, and they've got a stained glass window that's got his picture on it. And then he goes and establishes a church in Jamaica. And as a result of that, he becomes the first missionary in America. He's actually ahead of the man who went to India. So that was very important. They formed a church out at the Silver Bluff plantation, and slave by the name of David George, who was the personal attendant to George Galphin, he ends up leading the church there. After the Revolution, he goes to Nova Scotia, establishes a church, and then he later goes to Sierra Leone. As a result, he becomes the first ordained black pastor from South Carolina. So that's also important history. The important thing that happened was just before the American Revolution, the Indians the British had an Indian commissioner named John Stewart, who was very powerful. And he reported to the commander of the British forces in America. This is before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And he worked extremely hard to get the Native Americans to fight on the side of the British. If you were to add 10 to 20,000 Creek and Cherokee Indians fighting the way they fought, it would have changed the results of South Carolina and Georgia. The Continental Congress was headed by, this is before America, the Continental Congress was headed by John Hancock. So John Hancock was the leader of the Continental Congress. The vice president, second in charge, was Henry Lawrence from South Carolina. And he had regular communication with George Galphin because Galphin was the person who had the influence with all of the Indians. He knew them. and he could get things done. And why could he get things done is because he was honest with them. He knew them. They could trust him. He knew their language. And if you look at the books that have been written by George Galphin, they all say that. In the papers of in the papers of George Washington, it lists that Galphin saved at least 10,000 fighters from fighting on the side of the British. Henry Lawrence decided that he felt like that George Galphin was the saved South Carolina and Georgia on behalf of the Patriots more than anyone else. And so that is very important. And I'm gonna move on into something else, but if just during this period, just before the American Revolution, you had George Galphin playing a very key role in making sure that the Indians were not a part, it was not their property. And so that was very, very important. He writes this will in 1773. He knows he's getting older, and he's had something happen to him that he wants to make sure that all of his people are taken care of. It's one of the most extraordinary documents during the American Revolution. It's a 23-page handwritten will. In the will, it states that he lists all of his slaves by name. I mean, if you think about when you hear of slaves, it's rare that you have them listed by name and family and whatever. And I decided that I would go look at that will and I would create a document that had the names of all of those that were listed in the will. And I have that document over there. And I think that's amazing because not only in hearing the gospel on the plantations, but when they're listed by name, they're people, not property. And I think that was so very, very important. At the towards this period approaching the American Revolution, you had a situation where the Native Americans were buying much more stuff than the amount of hides that they were providing to the British. I mean, so it was a huge deficit was created, trade deficit. And around 1773, I keep going back to that date, but the Crown signed a contract with the Indians to have them cede 2,500,000 acres of Georgia land to cover the amount of debts that the Indians owed to the British Crown merchants and the Indian traders. And that's a huge amount.
Was that one particular tribe, or was it all of the
Primarily Cherokees. Okay. More Cherokees than Creeks.
Were they the ones that had the primary debt, or was it all of the Indians?
I think that in reality, all of them had debt. In fact, there were other tribes that were involved too, but it's primarily the Cherokees. And the Cherokees were kind of the western tribes that were. In fact, part of this talk is going to talk about the amount of monies that were owed to George Galphin. In his case, at the end of the American Revolution, he was owed 9,600 pounds sterling, which was a lot of money back then. Other traders were also owed a certain amount of money. And what happened was all of the traders that had the debt, their debt money owed them, they were paid, their debts were cleared. But George Galphin's was not cleared. And it just was not paid. You don't know why. And so the American Revolution takes place, and the lands that were ceded to the British Crown now becomes the state of Georgia property. The amount of the land that George Galphin had as collateral for his trading activities, and it's listed in absolute documents, was Wilkes County. So he is one of the first people to ever set foot in Wilkes County, and this debt that was originally part of the Crown is now state of Georgia. But the state of Georgia does not have the money to pay George Galphin. They were just broke at that time. And George Walton, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, he has the responsibility of making sure that the Indian traders get paid. He also knew that George Galphin was an honest trader and that he had helped the Patriots in so many different ways. And so he was in charge with the federal government to created a contract. And this contract said that the state of Georgia has responsibility to pay the debts of George Galphin, owed to George Galphin, and he said, until it's paid, now he wasn't thinking that it would take a long time to get this done because there was a lot of land that could be sold. And so he put 6% interest on that debt. And so it accrued from 1874, 1774, and it just never got paid. George Galphin dies, and going back to his will, he lists all these people. But 3 people. Oh, excuse me. He got married when he was 53 years old, and he wanted some legitimate heirs to his estate, his property. And this is all when things were good. And so Rachel Dupree gives him 2 kids, or what is called his white heirs. Their names Martha and Thomas. And Martha receives a lot of property in Georgia, around Milledge Road area, probably Augusta Country Club property, all that. Because we know that in the will, she got 2 500-acre parcels. George Galphin dies in 1780. Martha Galphin, when he dies, he's 16 years old. Thomas Galphin, who was the father of John Milledge Galphin, he was 17 years old. I mean, they're kids, they're young. In 1786, Martha Galphin marries John Milledge. And John Milledge was a revolutionary hero, helped save Savannah during the American Revolution. And his story, while he's married to Martha, was that he was a United States representative in George Washington's Congress, representative in John Adams' Congress, representative. After that, he resigns Congress and he runs for becoming the governor of the state of Georgia. And so from 1802 to 1806, he is the governor of Georgia. In 1801, he's part of a group of people that were given the responsibility to find a location for the University of Georgia. And they didn't have much money back then. John Milledge decides that he would like to have the opportunity to purchase the land and choose the location where the University of Georgia would be built. So he purchases 663 acres, gives it to the state. His group names Athens after Athens, Greece. So if you go to Athens, Georgia today, one of the biggest main roads there is Milledge Avenue. They created Milledgeville, Georgia, in honor of John Milledge, which it became the capital of Georgia through the Civil War. And after he became governor, he becomes a representative in Thomas Jefferson's cabinet, Congress, and he becomes a senator. He becomes senator, president pro tem of the Senate under Thomas Jefferson. So he was literally, and I was reading something in it, the most powerful man in Georgia. But it's amazing that while Martha was married to John Milledge, he was served in all of those Congresses. They were personal friends of Thomas Jefferson. When Martha and Thomas passed away in 1812, Governor Milledge adopts John Milledge Galphin as his son, his adopted son. So he lived with him. He ended up getting another wife and he had some kids, but they were really small. I mean, they're like 2 or 3 years old when he died. And he died in 1818. So his son that he knew was my grandma. He lived there. He sent him to med school. And in med school, to the University of Pennsylvania, which was the finest med school at that time. We've got over there his medical books. We've got his medical journal. He comes back. John Milledge died on February 9th. That's when he died, February 9th, 1880. John Milledge passed away. And John Milledge sets up a medical practice in Augusta. He marries a girl from Beach Island named Eliza Artist, and he sells the Augusta property and purchases the property where Red Cliff Plantation is located. He is a medical doctor in Beach Island for over 30 years, practicing there. He also served the Augusta Arsenal. His oldest son also became a medical doctor named John Milledge Galphin, and he was also a doctor for 30 years. But I think the key, and I want to answer some questions in a second, because the key here is that Isabel Vanderbilt felt this. I knew her, and that a lot of people didn't know much about George Galphin. But the reality is that he had tons of relationships with the knew the Indians, treated them well, and he was a good plantation owner. He didn't treat his family bad. Towards the end of his Indian trading career, he opened up a plantation, kind of like it was the Walmart of the area. So people in the entire area go there and buy stuff. So it wasn't always Indians there. It was people in the area. Something happened when I got to mention this. They never settled the claim. John Milledge Galphin in the 1830s, he went to George Crawford, who was a representative in the United States House of Representatives. And he said, I'm not going to get this money that's due owed John Milledge Galphin, but you try to get it for us. So John Milledge Galphin signed this document to George Crawford. He would collect the debt, get 50%. So it gets passed through all these administrations. I've got something over there that says it sat on Andrew Jackson's desk. So it gets all the way into Zach Taylor's administration. Oh, finally, the federal government took over the debt because Galphin had helped the whole cause of America. So it wasn't just a Georgia responsibility; it became a federal responsibility. And George Crawford never let anybody know that he was part of this, that he would be getting some money. So the portion of the government that was in charge of this paid the claim with $9,600 sterling. That ended up being like about $43,000. It got paid in check, got delivered by Alexander Stevens. Then George, in 1848, George Crawford said, well, you owe interest on the money at 6% from 1774, and it was $191,000. And he had this group of people, because it was a legitimate claim, legitimate document. George Walton is the one who did it. They paid it out in 1850. And that became a scandal. So there's a lot to that, but I've got paperwork. Got all the paperwork. So when they paid the claim, George Crawford's getting $97,000, millions of dollars now. The family, it got dribbled out to a lot. a lot of people. But that happened. Jack Taylor knew it. Said it was okay. I hope y'all know a little bit about George Galphin. Isabel Vanderbilt did a wonderful job creating a book about George Galphin, and the museum is selling them $5. And I signed him as a descendant of George Galphin. So if y'all would like to purchase one of those books, I think it's a good deal. It's got a lot of information. All of that's very accurate, so you can fact check me. Huh? Hey, I'm not involved. I may purchase a couple of them. I have to have the book, and I do Isabel. I love it. And it just deals with all of the descendants and everything. But I like ours because of this connection with John Milledge and, my family.